I think it is true that we are all in the same storm, but not in the same boat. Some people, um, I think they have found that their boats are actually floating better because they have more time with each other as families, and it's been quite a surprise. But for others, those that are not used to having their children at home or homeschooling, and those that have to work full-time jobs, they have to still do their jobs, but also take care of their children during the day. So it can be very hard for some families, and I think we have to be compassionate for the circumstances some people are in. So we're really not all in the same boat. We are all um, struggling with different things. And I think parenting is one of those things that we realize is the most important thing we do in our lives. I think if you ask a person what's the most important thing you will do in your life, I think parenting will usually come up near the top, if not the top. And every good parent wants their children to be happy and healthy. But the problem is we often don't know what happiness is or what makes us happy. The modern sense of happiness is actually found in the root for the word happiness, which is happens. And the modern sense of happiness is we are waiting for something to happen so that we can be happy. But the ancient view of happiness is different. It depended on the choices you make in your life, and it was connected to virtue. So there was something more than just circumstance or happenstance. And in this way, when you look at the work of Sonia Lyubomirsky, and this is a pie graph that just demonstrates the proportion of tendencies or circumstances or activities that lead to happiness. So the effects or the causes of happiness. Only 10% of our happiness varies based on our circumstances. And when I give talks on happiness, I often refer to Dan Gilbert's studies, which look at people who sustain spinal cord injuries and compare those to lottery winners, because many people have a vision of happiness that sometimes looks like winning a lottery. But in reality, a year later, the people who win lotteries are not any happier than the people who suffer severe traumas. And the important thing to take from this is that our happiness really doesn't depend on the things that happen to us as much as the choices we make in our life. And I think for many parents, they think that the way to happiness is success. So if you are able to do things to help your kids succeed, that they will be happy. And to a large extent, the reality is we have it a bit backwards, because success doesn't necessarily lead to happiness. There are lots of people who are successful who are unhappy. But the evidence actually shows, when they look at large cohorts of young people, that it is actually happiness that leads to success. People who are happy are generally healthier, they live longer, have better social networks, better self-esteem, that in general leads to increases in their success. I think for many, though, this lockdown was an opportunity to look at all of the things that we were doing because we had to stop them. And in this way, we can look at what we were doing and decide whether or not they were actually making us or our children more happy. There are different descriptions of parenting that is in some ways a type of over-parenting. So helicopter parents, snowplow parents, lawnmower parents. I saw another analogy of, I don't know if you guys do any curling, but there's this idea of where you make the ice really smooth so that the rocks go in a certain way. That's another type of parenting where you're trying to smooth everything out for your children. The question is, does that actually make our children more happy or more capable, or rather does it make them more anxious and dependent on us? And I think that is part of the problem we have when we, with the best of intentions, want to help our kids succeed. If we end up doing things for them to succeed, we are not helping them develop self-efficacy. So what is the cost of the overscheduling that I think many of us have experienced? As Pascal was saying, I am the father of 6 children. They have so many activities, and I spent so much time driving them to places. And I think at the end of the day, now that we were able to stop, we can ask the question, were the things that we were doing for fun, and were they decoupled in a way from achievements? In other words, was the thing that they were doing just so that they could achieve something, so that they could be successful and to be happy? Or was what they were doing actually making them happy? So the question is, have we forgotten what we were doing in the first place? And are we happier? I think it is well known that in the Western world, depression is growing at an incredible rate. The World Health Organization recently declared depression as the leading cause of disability. And rates of anxiety continue to grow with each successive decade. And this is even in the absence of an external stress like COVID-19. In some ways, other things in life were getting better, like lifespan, adjusted wealth. So health and wealth and some of these other things were getting better, but our mental health was not necessarily getting better. If anything, was actually getting worse. ADHD has become an epidemic, and we have to ask the question, why? And not just why, but also, is there something we can do about it? Is there something we can do to improve the happiness of our children? I'd like to propose 8 ways that we can raise the happiness of our children. And it uses this acronym parental. So I'll try to go over each of these things. So starting with P, which would be proactive, the idea is not to be reactive or just reacting to problems, but trying to create and innovate solutions for ourselves and our children. And to be proactive means to recognize that our choices make a difference. And I believe that this is, I think, empowering, because we are able to, with the decisions we make, change the trajectory of our lives and the lives of our children. And I think one of the things that we can do is to keep a focus on why it is we do what we do. You know, I think if you keep in mind why you are parenting, the goal is to raise happy children. And as Viktor Frankl said, quoting Friedrich Nietzsche in Man's Search for Meaning, a why can bear almost any how. So as long as you keep that in mind, you know, we are doing this for the sake of our children. That can be the power behind everything that we do. I'd recommend, and this is something Stephen Covey suggests, a mission statement. This is a clear mission that informs all your family's priorities, and it's something that you guys can create together as a family. What has value to you, and what can you all agree upon? This photo is a picture of a couch with a bunch of crayons written all over it. And I remember very vividly when my son was much younger, my wife and a few mothers had a play group, and one of the kids drew all over a couch. And my son said to my wife, he said, is this boy going to go to jail? You know, obviously not, but it is funny. And I think what is funny at the age of 3 is not as funny at the age of 13. So I do believe that we need to try and do things earlier, because anything that happens when they're younger does tend to reoccur when they're older. So the terrible twos and the temper tantrums and the difficulties you might have when they're younger, if you do not help your children develop the skills to overcome, to problem solve, and have some frustration tolerance and flexibility, they will struggle with these problems later on. So I would suggest beginning with the end in mind. What is it that you want to end up with your children? James Stenson, who is an author that's written several parenting books, suggests that one way of looking at it is to raise your kids in a way that you would want to raise partners for your children. So think about what you would want for the partners of your children and try to raise your children that way. And there is an analogy for wiring. For those of you that have had an old house and had to try and fix it, it is much easier to do the wiring before the walls go up. And where it comes to the brain, most of the brain development happens early. So it is important to try, at least, to make some of these changes earlier before the walls proverbially go up. And neurosciences show that much happens in the first 2 years of life, and these early years can be quite critical. So keep in mind that a lot of the development occurs early on. Much of the brain growth actually occurs in the first 2 years, and the synaptic connections that happen in the brain occur in the first few years, but are pruned or modified as we grow older. And the brain, even though its growth stops, it still continues to develop throughout childhood. And in fact, the frontal lobes continue to develop into your early 20s. But the important thing to keep in mind is that early childhood has a huge impact on who we become. There's a nice video on the first 1,000 days of our lives, which is essentially the first couple of years. And parents for sure can have a huge effect. I remember one of the things that I had heard from an experienced parent about 20 years ago that made a huge difference in our own lives for our kids was this experienced parent told me that one of the greatest gifts you can give your kids is to help them learn to fall asleep on their own. And one thing we did was we let our kids, when they were babies, we put them down to bed in their cribs while they were still awake. And I think that helped them self-soothe and learn that it was okay to be on their own and to manage. I think the danger of putting your kids to bed only when you've cuddled them creates a kind of dependency on you and a feeling that you need someone to fall asleep safely. So that was something that was extremely helpful for me. So these kinds of things early in your childhood can have big effects later on. So sleep hygiene, or being the ability to fall asleep on your own without help, is a very good thing. So the next letter of parental is adventure. And I think it's important for us to have fun and let our children have fun too. Studies suggest that some of the happiest times we experience in our lives are when we're having fun. And we can transform our lives into one where we try to make the life we have as an adventure, both for you and your family. For many, this lockdown has given us more time to think about how we can have fun together. I know for us, as a family, we have played board games together more than we ever had, and we've gone for walks together as a family, and it's been quite a beautiful thing. And as we face some of these challenges, including this massive lockdown, we realize that we cannot direct the wind, but we can adjust the sails. So there are some things that are completely out of our control, but there are things that we can control. So regardless of what we face, everything can be seen as a kind of adventure. You know, I think in this particular case, the fight that we have had over the last 3 months was one to protect the elderly and the vulnerable. We did this largely for people who couldn't protect themselves. And I wonder, you know, in the years that come ahead, what will the children remember about this time and what will they learn? G.K. Chesterton once said, "An adventure is only an inconvenience rightly considered." I think what we can do is help our children face obstacles as a challenge to overcome. There is this concept of trampoline parents rather than helicopter, snowplow, or lawnmower parents. So the idea of a trampoline parent is you help your kids bounce back. You help them experience these things. Dr. Jaina, who I have a link later on, talks about wobble skills in the skills for the 20th century. And part of those skills is the ability to fail, but also pick yourself up. pick yourself back up. I think what that tends to do is it helps develop problem-solving abilities when things don't go well, flexibility and frustration tolerance. So it is said that a comfort zone is a beautiful place, but nothing ever grows there. I think we grow when we are facing adversity, and adventure is something that can help us grow in many ways. I think one of the most beautiful things you can do with your children and most powerful is reading. You can improve their empathy and their understanding of others. You can share with them the adventure and imagination that comes from reading. It's both creative and contemplative, and you can help them discover the wonder of stories. It goes beyond just literacy, which of course literacy is important, and I'll talk about that in a few slides later. But you're not just with literacy, you're also helping them see the beauty of creativity and wonder. Where it comes to adventure, it's also important for us to play with our children because it helps build bonds with them. There is literature to suggest that it strengthens parents that play with their children, it strengthens their relationships, and there are biological mechanisms that explain why, including elevations of oxytocin. There is also studies that suggest that with young kids, you can, with blocks, improve their reading skills. So this was a study done with about 200 children in Seattle, in a clinic in Seattle, and half of the group had blocks in the beginning and half at the end. And they spent a certain amount of time each day playing with these blocks, and then they did literacy or language assessments after. And this was a group of impoverished children. And they found that those that had blocks received early actually read above their age group, which was impressive for those that were in a lower socioeconomic state, as opposed to those that received the blocks late, which was 42% of the percentile. So the next letter of parental is responsiveness. And it's the degree, as this developmental psychologist Diane Baumrein said, parental responsiveness refers to the degree to the parent responds to the child's needs in a supportive and accepting manner. There is evidence from the British cohort study of 1970. They followed 17,000 children that were born in 1 week in April in 1970. And they found that parents that read to their children at 5 years and took an interest in their schooling had a big effect on the trajectory of where they ended up. So parental engagement, more than anything, predicted how things went for them. And I think for us to be responsive, that means helping your children develop problem solving, flexibility, and frustration tolerance. And there are different ways to look at responsiveness. You can look at from a perspective of continuing your attachment with your children, as per Gary Neufeld. But I think there is something to be said for not letting your children go in a way. You also want them to fly, as I was saying, with their own wings. But you also want to make sure that they know you are still there. They still have the roots, as it were. So communicating with your children is also a type of responsiveness. So talk so your children will listen, and listen so your children will talk. As Stephen Covey once said, to be understood, you have to listen. And you can't always just talk to your children without trying to understand where they're coming from. And to be adaptive, it also means understanding your children, and when they are not listening, trying to understand why. And there may be very many reasons why children don't listen or they behave in a certain way. And part of it may be temperament. So some of this is genetics. There's a role of nature and nurture and personality. But there's also things related to family of origin, of parents and where you come from and the way that you raise your children. Temperaments, when different temperaments match up, sometimes that leads to conflict and patterns of behavior that can be a problem. So we run into ruts with some children. There are some children that we get along so well with and we connect with and have no problems with, but there are other children, for reasons that you can't really understand, they just don't. And part of that is because of temperament, part of their personality. So there may be individual traits and mismatches, which is part of why a cookie cutter approach to parenting doesn't work. You need to be flexible and to realize that some of the things that you do for your children may make one child very calm and relaxed, but may make another child very anxious or unhappy. So it is important to appreciate that your children are all different and they have different personalities. And to realize that when these temperaments interact, sometimes you run into these ruts. Sue Johnson, who's a psychologist, talks about this in emotion-focused therapy. When you have with couples and they run into trouble, they run into the same patterns of trouble, and she refers to this as the dance of wounds. So when you realize you're running into the same ruts or the same kinds of challenges again and again, it's important to step out and to look at why that is. Now, this is an important thing that a parent once shared with me. The importance of rules and relationships. The children do much better when they have a strong relationship with you, and you don't need strict rules as much when you have a strong relationship. So our type of responsiveness, as it were, can come from developing your relationship. I was listening to a talk about a teacher who was saying, you know, if your kids don't think if they don't like you, they're not going to listen to you. And if they don't get the sense that you care, as Teddy Roosevelt once said, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. I think as long as kids understand that it is from a caring place, that you are responsive, it's much more effective. You know, whenever you're looking at a problem with your kids and you're trying to understand why it is you are having it, look to the relationship. Now, the other thing of, so the idea of responsiveness and expectations come from the work of Diane Baumrein, who did a lot of research with North American parenting. And one of the things that she talks about in addition to being very responsive to your children, you also want to have expectations. And happiness comes, I think, from living a good life. This is what the ancient view of happiness from Aristotle said. Our happiness comes from our habits. It comes from our character. And it comes from a life well lived, as Eleanor Roosevelt said. Happiness is not a goal, but a byproduct of a life well lived. And, you know, a good life would be a life of fairness, courage, self-control, and wisdom. And more than anything, our children learn from our examples and not by what we say. So if you treat them unfairly, or if you're not strong and brave, or if you have no self-control and the children don't think you know what you're talking about, they're not going to really listen to you. So you need to model these kinds of things for your kids, to have self-control and wisdom and fairness, because that is much more how they will learn than just the words that you say to them. Structure is really important. Routines, there is evidence I'll show you from some studies looking from the British Millennium UK cohort, that demonstrate that bedtime and discipline has a big outcome on your children's trajectory. There is also evidence from chores in the Harvard Grant Glueck study. This is the study on human development that I will talk about later. There is evidence too, in terms of expectations, that kids do well with structure or better with structure. There's the playground experiment where they allowed children to play, these preschool children. They went to 2 playgrounds, one with a fence and one without one. And they found that children who were playing in a place with a fence did better because they knew the limits and they felt secure to go and explore with their teacher in the playground. One other thing, I think, when you look at structure is our children, This is a rule from Jordan Peterson. He's a psychologist in Toronto. This is rule number 5 from his 12 rules for life. He says, do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. And I have seen many parents and children in places where you can sense that much of what the children are doing is very unpleasant for the parents. So Ron Morsch is someone I actually really like this book, 12 Keys for Raising Responsible Children. He said that independence isn't doing your own thing, it's doing what's right on your own. And self-discipline does need to be taught. There is a saying that, if you don't discipline your children or help them to develop self-control, the world will discipline them for you. And I think it's important for us to realize that no is also a loving word. Your children need to hear it from time to time to help acquire self-control. Children who never experience loving denial, which is the concept of self-denial, it can lead to disaster later. So in other words, if they are never able to say no on their own with your help, they will have a much harder time saying no to themselves later when you're not around. This is from the cover of Time magazine in 2012, and asked the question, why are American children brats, some of them brats? And they compare, this is from the book Bringing Up Bébé, French and American Parenting, and they talk about how French children tend to be better socialized because they say hello, thank you, goodbye, and please. And one of the things I think they learn from that is they aren't the only ones with feelings and needs. I remember very profoundly, my father and we put on Scarface when we were younger, and there was so much swearing. My father got so angry at us. It made me realize that respect is a really important thing for us to have for people. And when you swear a lot, there is a sense that you don't really care what other people think about you. I think French children, as from this book suggests, they can be more polite and they're better socialized. One of the things, as I was saying from the Grant study, they found that children who were assigned chores, so the Grant study, they followed initially a bunch of Harvard undergraduate men and then followed them now for 80 years. They've also combined it with the Boston Gluick study. But they found that children who were assigned chores and assigned chores early had much better outcomes in their lives. And that's an important thing. This is from a TED Talk where she quotes this part of the study. This is from a former freshman dean at Stanford. And you can imagine why that is. It only makes sense. Children who do chores, they take responsibility. It's not just about themselves. And, it's not even for the work that they do. I think it's more for an effect on their own character and their own soul. I think for children that do these things and they're assigned work, they develop the sense of responsibility and being part of something bigger than themselves. It's much more necessarily than the work that they do. So this is data from the UK Millennium Cohort Study. And they found that 3-year-old children who had regular bedtimes, meal times, and limits on their television had better emotional self-regulation. And the lack of regular bedtime and poor emotional self-regulation were independent predictors of obesity at the age of 11. This is an interesting study because they looked at not only the kids with non-regular bedtimes and their behavioral difficulties. This is again from the same 10,000 kids, 7-year-olds from the UK Millennium Cohort Study. They found that not only is it important to have regular bedtimes, but if you have non-regular bedtimes, those that changed to regular bedtimes developed statistically significant improvement in their behavior. So if your children are not going to sleep at the regular times, even in this time of COVID, routine is really important and it affects children. Sleep is really important too. And if you can get your children to sleep at the same time, wake up at the same time, if you can get them to brush their teeth and prepare for school even if they're staying home to do school, it will have an impact, I think, on their lives and even in their time at home. It's also important to limit your screen time. And it's easier said than done, I think, if you're stuck at home. And there is evidence that, we as a society have moved to increasing our exposure to children's technology early on. So this is work from Dr. Christotakis, and he said that the average age of starting media exposure in 1970 was the age of 4, and now it's the age of 10 months. And he found that for every hour of TV viewing before the age of 3 led to an increase of 10% likelihood of developing attentional difficulties. And cognitive stimulation reduced the problem. So reading to your children and doing educational things like blocks and those kinds of things, actually each hour per day reduce the risk of ADHD by 30%. So there are things we can do to counter some of the effects of screen time. The problem with screen time is that the exposure rewires the brain when they're younger. So the mind expects high levels of stimulation and leads to inattention later on. But the good news is that it matters what we watch. So if you watch the Powerpuff Girls, it's very different than watching Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, because Fred Rogers, not a lot happens very quickly in the scenes. Whereas in the Powerpuff Girls, there's multiple scene transitions, which can lead to inattention later on. And this is also work from his lab, from Dr. Christotakis' lab. And they found that educational viewing actually did not raise attentional problems, but watching things for entertainment or things that had violence in it did lead to problems. So be careful what your children watch. There is also evidence from this large meta-analysis that looked at screen use and child language skills. And if you had screen time that was recreational, it was very different than the screen time that was more educational. And when you watch TV with your children, so this is referred to as co-viewing, and you can learn a lot, I think, when you watch with your kids, talk to them about it, it can be very helpful. So it matters what you watch, how much you watch it, but also what it is you watch. There is an association between screen time at bed and also sleep habits, and it can lead to sleep problems. So one caution to you is to limit the media use, the screen time media use just before bed, because it can lead to problems with sleep. As I was saying before, we know that depression and suicide have gone up. In fact, suicide rates in adolescence has gone up 600% in the last 60 years. And it continues to increase. From 2010 to 2015, rates of depression and suicide went up by about 30%. And analysis from this large cohort from the CDC of about 500,000 US adolescents, they found that if you watched more than 5 hours of screen time, it led to increases in suicidal risk behaviors. So that's the bad news. The good news is that there are other things that can counter that. And one of those things is homework and print media use. So reading books, magazines, or newspapers has an effect in the opposite direction than screen time. So there are other things you can do, like exercise and reading books that can help with the screen time effects. So it is important. The next letter is nutrition. N for nutrition. Feed your children the right things. I learned early on with my children, when they were if they were difficult, one thing that helped was actually feeding them. And this works also for young children, but teenagers too. If you have a teenager who's really cranky and hard to get along with, try giving them a snack. It's amazing. The triggers for substance abuse, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, can be very helpful. If you have a child and you're having some sort of fight or disagreement, try feeding them. You can also try and see. It's not good to talk when you're angry, but if they're lonely or tired, try and wait till they're not like that. It's important to read because that has a huge effect. As I was saying, this is the big word gap they refer to, the 30 million word gap between those that are poor and those that have money. The number is actually probably closer to 4 million words per year, and it has an effect on their long-term trajectory. So And it is something you can change by reading to your children. You can actually increase their word vocabulary and density by reading to them. So there is lots of research to support this. I won't go over all of it, but you can help them discover the beauty of reading, and it can change their lives. And reading by the age of 3 is a key part, because you teach them you don't just learn to read, you also read to learn after the age of 3. So if they have not learned to read by that time, you're setting them backwards and giving them a real disadvantage. It's important to have new skills and to innovate. This is a talk by Dr. Jaina, who talks about the 21st century skills that we need to develop, as 2/3 of our jobs for our children have actually not yet been created. So please check out this YouTube video. I found it very helpful. This is work from Mickey Csikszentmihalyi, that used to be a psychologist from Chicago, that talked about this flow channel. And as I was saying before, when we have our children doing too many things and there are too many challenges and anxiety, it's overwhelming, and it's not good when it overwhelms their skills, including, if they have to sacrifice sleep to do some of these things. Is it really worth it? The other important thing I wanted to say is the importance of parental unity. You want your children to have one voice inside their head, not two, if they're going to internalize one of them. And it is said that a kiss on the forehead of your partner is like a kiss on the forehead of each of your children. I think it's also important to eat together. There's evidence that more than half of the people eat on their own, either in front of a computer, on the car, or on the go. And there is actually lots of evidence to suggest that children do better when they eat together, eat meals together. They learn how to conduct conversations, they learn manners, to serve others, to listen, and to compromise. And it also helps you share their lives. You find out what happened in the day and what was meaningful to them. They tend to have better academic performance, higher self-esteem, greater senses of resilience, lower risks of substance abuse, lower risks of teen pregnancy, lower risks of depression, and lower likelihoods of developing eating disorders. So this is just a graph of some of the effects of eating together for different substance abuses. I found actually with my children, there is lots of research to suggest that those that are spiritually committed are more happy. But I have found that even if you did not have a faith, one thing that happens when you pray together is you tend to be humble, contrite, hopeful, and honest. And one thing that I used to do when I was driving my kids to school before the lockdown is we used to pray on the way to school every day. And you kind of found out what was really important to them, what they hoped for, what they were sorry about. And also when they heard you pray, they also realize that you're human, that you make mistakes. And I think they get to know you a lot better. The next A is awareness, to appreciate what you have, and to try and balance acceptance and aspiration. So awareness is the greatest agent for change in life. And we need to accept some things, like our own abilities are not the same. Some of us have disabilities. Some of my children had learning disabilities, and we had to learn to work through that. Temperaments are different. Choices that people freely make are also not within your control. And that's also something that's hard to accept. But one thing you want to do is you want to help your children choose to have hope and to be constructive, to always try and make things better and not worse. There is evidence from the UK Million Women study. It was actually 700,000 women. And they found that education, exercise, and there are things that we can do to help ourselves. So we want to help our children aspire to something greater and to always try to improve ourselves. And we should never be too busy to try to improve. It's also important to have gratitude. It's hard to be sad when you're grateful. And I think the foundation of everything is to have love. That's the reason why we do everything. There is evidence that people who give are happier than those that receive. And the biggest or longest study on human development, as I was mentioning, is the Grant study. And they found that people who had good relationships when they're earlier had much better outcomes in their life. They lived longer, they were happier, they were less likely to develop dementia. So as the saying goes, parents etch on the hearts of children that which the cold hands of the world cannot rub out. And in many ways, parenting is love that lasts more than a lifetime. And as Martin Luther King once said, those who are not looking for happiness are the most likely to find it, because those that are searching forget that the surest way to be happy is to seek the happiness of others. So this is the summary, and I won't go through it again. But I think one of the things that G.K. Chesterton said that really moved me was, he said, the business done in the home is nothing less than the shaping of the bodies and souls of humanity, because the family is the factory that manufactures mankind. Now we'll try to stop here. No, I'm quite late.
That's all good. It was very interesting. So thank you very much, Dr. Lau, for sharing your knowledge and your experience on raising happier children. This is certainly something as we parents and caregivers can strive to do. We do have some questions, so I'll just see if, let me just reach out, if I can just see the questions. I'm just saying, we've had some comments, and I'm just looking to see if there's questions. I think they're just typing up some questions here for us.
I think some people had questions earlier. I had seen from, there was a question about whether or not some kids are just happy and some kids aren't. I think that was someone had.
Yeah, that was one of the questions here. So why is it that some children just seem happier than others? My kids are very different. One is more sullen. One is always happy. Are they born this way? Or why is it even within the same family, you can have two children that are so different and so polar apart? So how would you explain that?
Well, the work of Sonia Lyubomirsky and supported by Ed Diener, the research suggests that happiness, 50% of happiness is genetic. So there is a genetic component for sure. And when you look at personality, there are some types of traits that are more associated with happiness, like extroversion and low levels of neuroticism. Those things there is some genetics involved, but it's not a determinist solution, meaning just because you have a predisposition to something doesn't mean you are doomed to be unhappy. So for example, people who might have a predisposition to being lazy can also join the army and become incredibly disciplined through their choices and their habits. So personality is not static or fixed. So there are things you can do, even if you're predisposed in a certain way, to change it. So that's what I would say. I think just like the model for obesity, you know, we might have a gene, we might have a predisposition to being overweight, but we can still exercise and we can eat less and we can be fit. So you should not lose hope if your child is less happy. It doesn't mean that the choices that they make can't change that. And the choices that you help them make also can change that. You can help your children be happy. It is, and in some ways it's the choices that will have a bigger effect because they overcome those genes.
Okay, good one. We have another question. How do I get my 12-year-old to focus more on the positive things in life? He seems to only focus on the negative. So I think getting into the teen age, we often see that where it's a bit negative. So how do we go about?
Some of it's developmental. You know, I think teenagers, as they're getting older, they're trying to separate from you and to challenge you in some ways because they're trying to develop their own sense of identity. So there's a natural tendency to, and your children as teenagers will even judge you. I think that's something you tend to see. So how do you help them become more positive? One reality is that we cannot change how we feel, but we can change how we think. We can change what we do. And one thing to do is to talk to them, engage with them, develop your relationships with them, help them understand where they're coming from. I think one of the challenges that children have is they feel that they are not listened to. They feel some of them feel neglected or ignored, or that their own opinions don't matter. And that's also not good. I think children need to have the sense that you care and that you understand where they're coming from. I do think, though, that teenagers in particular, because there is a developmental process with hormones, some stuff is not necessarily rational. But but they will, I think, later on come around. There's a saying that, you know, as I turned 30, I suddenly realized that my parents were smarter than I used to think they were. So I think that does happen as your kids grow up. There are times where it doesn't always make sense, and the only way to respond to something that doesn't make sense is to try and have a rational approach and to, you know, understand where someone's coming from. Why is it that they're so angry? Why is it that they're so negative? Well, try to listen to them and talk to them. The only way to really get into their lives is to be part of it.
Good answer. Can certainly use that in my own life with my teenagers. There's one more question here. You mentioned that early wiring helps children develop to be happier. If that opportunity was missed, what can I do as a parent to help my children be happier? So is there just a time, like a definite period where we need to get the wiring done? I think it's before the first 5 years of life, but if we didn't put in enough, is there something that we can do?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not static either. I mean, it's easier to do the work earlier, but not impossible. For those that renovate homes, you can make a beautiful home after the wiring is in. You can change it. So it takes a bit more work, but for sure, the thing that will power it is love. You know, if you have a child who, you know, is struggling with self-control, and, you know, they had the problem when they were younger, and then they also have the problem when they're teenagers. I think the way to overcome that is through your relationship with them. You know, I was saying the thing of rules and relationships. You know, when they're not following the rules, work on the relationship. Try to strengthen your relationship with them, because when they feel like you care and that you're there and that you're solid, they at least have something to come back to. Because I was saying roots and wings. You want them to feel like they have a place to go and a safe place to return to as they're trying to discover themselves.
Okay. Let me see if there's one more question here. We have time. I'm divorced. What's the most important thing I should know when co-parenting my daughter who is entering her teen years?
Well, like I was saying, of the T part is to try to do things together. If the other parent is involved, work together. You know, I think it doesn't help your child to feel like there is still fighting between the two of you. You want to work together because you care about the child, and that has to be the source of everything. It has to be love. And I think children do a lot better when they feel like their parents are you know, they don't have bad feelings towards the other parent. You don't want to have your child caught in the middle between conflict between two adults. So I think as a parent, as a divorced parent, I think the thing is to help them know that they're still loved, and in a way, if you can, also try to express the love that you have for the other parent, and to say that they still, it's not about them, it's not about the children, that you know, that they're not together, and to try and make love the center of everything. Yeah, I would say that involve the other person, and try to avoid conflict, because the children will absorb some of this. It's inevitable. So try not to put them in the middle.
Okay. I think this is all the time. Very much, Dr. Lau, for sharing your knowledge, your experience on raising happier kids. Certainly something we can look forward to and strive to do with our children. If we do have extra questions, we just want to let you know that we will be posting answers to any questions that we couldn't get to on our PIO or Parenting in Ottawa Facebook page. So please like our pages and follow up for our updates. Again, thank you, Dr. Lau. And I also want to thank everyone for joining us today. Hopefully you found this information useful. We also would like to thank our partners at the Royal, and also the incredible team, mental health team, that has worked so hard at Ottawa Public Health to put this together. And we're really happy to have you here. It's very interesting. Please stay tuned, everybody, for other upcoming events. And we wish you all a great day. Thank you so much.
Happy Thursday.
You too.